Hello, my name is Nazlin Bhimani and I'm the Research Support and Special Collections Librarian at UCL's Institute of Education. My talk today explores how eugenics shaped British education and legitimized the exclusion of disabled people. When you hear the words eugenics, many of us immediately think of the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. But the roots of eugenic thinking reach much further back, at least to the ancient Greeks in the West. In this presentation, I will focus on the development of modern eugenics from the 19th century to the early 20th century. This coincided with the establishment of mass schooling in Britain, and when ideas about heredity, intelligence, and social value gained scientific authority, with education becoming one of the key areas in which these ideas were applied. Throughout this presentation, I will be using historical language that may be offensive. I use this language only in its historical context, to analyze and critique these ideas, never to endorse or perpetuate them. Underlying all of this is the concept of ideology, those taken for granted assumptions that quietly shape our thinking. Eugenics functioned as such an ideology. It was a silent presence that made certain hierarchies appear natural, inevitable, or simply common sense. I hope you will bear this in mind. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 introduced the theory of evolution by natural selection, transforming scientific understandings of how life began in the natural world. Some thinkers, such as 19th century philosopher Herbert Spencer, quickly applied these biological ideas to human society, popularizing the phrase survival of the fittest. This gave rise to social Darwinism, the belief that social progress results from competition in which the best or the fittest naturally rise to the top. It was in this intellectual climate that Francis Galton, Darwin's half-cousin, developed the idea of eugenics. Galton was a polymath, a statistician, anthropologist, and meteorologist, and he wondered whether these theories could be applied to the human race. In his 1883 book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, he introduced the term eugenics, borrowed from the Greek meaning well-born. He defined it as a science of improving human stock to ensure that the more suitable races or strains of blood would prevail. From the beginning, Galton saw eugenics as having two strands. He distinguished between positive eugenics, which involved encouraging reproduction among those deemed to be fit and have desirable characteristics, and negative characteristics, which sought to limit or prevent reproduction among those considered to have undesirable traits or who were deemed unfit. These ideas were controversial from the start and met with resistance from the Catholic Church and from some social reformers. They were wary of interventions that might interfere with family life, moral obligations, or social welfare. Earlier, some of the underlying concerns about poverty, social degeneration, and the vulnerability of the disabled had already been documented. But Galton's focus on controlling reproduction through selective measures represented a more radical step. In response to criticism, in 1904, speaking at the Sociological Society's meeting at the London School of Economics, Galton offered a more palatable definition. He stated, "Eugenics is a science which deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, and also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage." This redefinition presented eugenics as a philanthropic pursuit rather than a coercive program. It marked the beginnings of what historians have called reform eugenics, as it became more closely tied to social and education policy. At the core of Galton's thinking was the belief that intelligence and human traits, such as criminality, drunkenness, alcoholism, and moral capacity, were innate, inherited, and essentially fixed. He believed that physical attributes correlated with mental potential, and that such characteristics could be identified and measured and used to rank individuals within populations. He suggested that feeble-mindedness and degeneracy, the two main categories of unfitness, could be combated through improved education, sanitation, and hygiene, the latter being physical and moral hygiene. And in this way, eugenics would solve many of society's problems. This sparked the nature versus nurture debate. Galton and his followers maintained a predominantly hereditarian stance, asserting that nurture accounted for only 1/10 to 1/5 of an individual's development. This view contrasted sharply with long-standing educational traditions dating back to John Locke, which held that 9/10 of an individual's development was based on their upbringing. The concept of tabula rasa, or blank slate, where an individual was influenced by their environment. But this worldview raised a major practical question for Galton and his followers. How could inborn qualities of fitness be identified and measured? To answer this, they turned to a new school of measurement. In 1884, Galton presented his anthropometric laboratory at the International Health Exhibition in London. Here he collected physiological data from members of the public who paid 3p to receive a personalized biometric card. It included the results of their physical and sensory tests, including height, weight, strength, sight, hearing, and reaction times. Galton was particularly interested in identifying the gifted, and he believed that by gathering data on large numbers of ordinary people, he could map the distribution of human qualities and identify those of exceptional civic worth. He did this by using statistical methods, including correlation, which he had invented. This laboratory moved to University College in the same year and was renamed the Eugenics Record Office. From the late 1890s, Galton began taking biometric measurements of school children to study their individual differences. His work was supported by head teachers, and this collaboration resulted in a primitive form of the student card. It contained biometric data and family history. Gradually, eugenics infiltrated the education system via the school medical service. Medics saw children as potential subjects for a larger eugenic survey of the nation to determine their fitness, that is, their physical, mental, and moral fitness. The move to UCL and the recognition of eugenics as a science by the University of London Senate ensured an explicit turn towards heredity and population improvement. It gave Galton's biometrics academic credibility. As these ideas gained credibility, powerful networks began forming to translate eugenic theory into social policy, shaping public discourse in the process. The acceptance of eugenics grew in the early 20th century, particularly after the Second Boer War in 1902, when Britain suffered enormous losses, largely due to the physical condition of her soldiers. This raised concern about Britain's declining imperial might. One immensely powerful individual was the educationalist Sidney Webb. He was the chairman of the London County Council's Technical Education Board and its Higher Education Subcommittee. Webb was also the founding member of the London School of Economics, and it was he who proposed the creation of the London Day Training College, later the Institute of Education. In 1907, Webb, concerned about the declining birth rate among the more affluent classes, wrote in one of his Fabian tracts that if this trend continued, the empire would fall into the hands of the Irish, the Jews, and ultimately the Chinese. The way forward was to implement measures that would ensure national efficiency. This became the justification for many decisions in social policy and education in the early 20th century. Others in this network included the intellectual classes, academics, teacher trainers, feminists, and also members of the medical profession, as well as famous writers such as W.B. Yeats and D.H. Lawrence. Yeats and Lawrence were inspired by the writings of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche promoted the idea of the Superman and the breeding of a master race. Yeats and Lawrence believed that education should only be available to the privileged few, and that mass education should be abandoned. The working classes, they thought, should not be taught to read and write or to think, because their place was either in the home for women or in physical or manual labor for the men. Lawrence's 1908 letter to one of his girlfriends reveals his genocidal fantasy and shows how elitist thinking could legitimize the elimination of those deemed unfit. Here are his words. These weren't marginal figures. They were celebrated intellectuals shaping public discourse, and their ideas were gaining political traction. The shift from theory to policy accelerated with the founding of the Eugenics Education Society in 1907. Its stated aim was to preserve the Anglo-Saxon race by educating the public. It was the propaganda arm of the eugenicists. In 1909, the Society launched the journal The Eugenics Review, which provided a platform for eugenic research to be published. And it should be noted that this journal continued to publish under the same title until 1968, giving eugenics sustained legitimacy. One of the first studies to be published in the journal was by the neurologist Alfred Treadgold. In his paper entitled The Feeble-Minded, a Social Danger, which was summarized in the Times Education Supplement, whose readership included teacher trainers, Treadgold claimed that many of the poor were idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, or mentally defective, who contributed nothing to the nation. What was worrying was that this rate of degeneracy amongst this group was growing, and he urged that intelligent citizens of a great empire must see that this social evil was removed and that this tide of degeneracy is stemmed. These messages were not neutral, as they disproportionately targeted the poor classes and the people with disabilities. The paper reached the cabinet through Winston Churchill, then president of the Board of Trade, helping to shape new legislation that would control the future of disabled people. It was this eugenic logic that underpinned the Mental Deficiency Act that passed in 1913. This was the first eugenic law in the United Kingdom, and instead of relaxing aspects of the law, it was tightened in 1927. The Act aimed to stem the great evil of feeble-mindedness, an elastic term, an ill-defined term that enabled authorities to target the lower classes, particularly those considered morally degenerate or socially inefficient. Enforcement was zealous. Father and son John and Samuel Wormald would wait outside schools to forcibly remove children. Those labeled idiots or imbeciles, crude labels for people with learning difficulties, were wrenched from their homes and incarcerated in so-called colonies, such as those at Sandalbridge and Meanwood Park. Many were young people that were incarcerated for life because of petty crimes or because they were unmarried mothers or pregnant teenagers. In parallel, some 12,000 defective children were placed in special schools. They were not provided an academic education, but only trained in basic skills, as authorities maintained that people who do not live in society do not need the tools of society. In 1931, a eugenic sterilization bill failed to pass Parliament. However, the Mental Deficiency Act remained in force until 1959. over 46 years, when thousands of lives were lost and wasted. But how were these defective children identified? The answer lay in intelligence testing, which was already being developed and refined as a tool of categorization and exclusion. The most influential figure in embedding eugenics into educational practice was Cyril Burt. In 1913, the same year the Mental Deficiency Act was passed, the London County Council appointed him as their first educational psychologist. By this time, Burt had already tested children in Liverpool schools and, based on these early experiments, published his mental foot rule. This was in 1909. He claimed that the tests could determine a child's potential from as early as 6 years. While his mental foot rule adapted the tests developed by Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon in Paris, which were designed to identify children falling behind academically so that they could receive additional support, Burt used his tests for a completely different ideological purpose, and that was to measure children's supposedly fixed inherited intelligence, categorizing them as gifted, normal, or subnormal. Burt's belief, which he maintained throughout his life, were uncompromising, especially regarding those he considered subnormal, as this quote illustrates. The tests were fundamentally flawed. They measured attainment rather than the higher order abstract thinking and reasoning abilities they claimed to assess. They were also culturally biased. They contained general knowledge questions aligned to a more privileged lifestyle. As a result, the tests reflected social class more than innate intelligence. Though Burt and his colleagues very often referred to socioeconomic backgrounds, home environments, health, malnutrition, and medical issues, they consistently returned to the idea that intelligence and character traits were fixed and innate. Furthermore, they ignored the fact that poorer areas of the city had difficulty recruiting qualified teachers. Test results in these areas were reframed as evidence that these children were mentally deficient and in many cases ineducable. They also blamed these children for lowering the standards across the city. When the results of the tests were published in 1917, the London County Council's Chief Education Officer, Robert Blair, stated that the new test would, quote, lift the practice of teaching and lay it on a broad scientific foundation. This is exactly what university-based educationalists were attempting to do. They had long struggled to establish a science of education, and the test provided an opportunity to position the field as a serious academic subject with a research tradition. In doing so, they could raise both the profile of the field and the professional status of teachers. Burt's work did not develop in isolation. Eugenics was part of a global movement with organized networks, international conferences that enabled the sharing of research and practices across Europe, the United States, and parts of the British Empire. In the United States, the academic and psychoeugenicist Lewis Terman adapted the Binet-Simon test to create the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale. During the First World War, it was used to identify soldiers that were officer-class material, and later to identify gifted individuals thought to possess the leadership qualities necessary to ensure a nation's future. Terman's tests were also applied by the Board of Education in 1923 to assess retarded children, including physically disabled canal boat and gypsy children, as well as children considered to be backward. Grouping these children together demonstrates eugenic logic in practice, linking race, disability, and social marginality as markers of innate educational deficiency. What is particularly revealing is a network of influence behind this test. It was a small, interconnected circle of psychoeugenicists, inspectors, and educators who validated each other's work, embedding eugenic ideas into practice, and giving eugenics the appearance of scientific legitimacy. The author of this test was HMI Gordon, who had his work reviewed favorably by his colleague HMI Ballard. Both worked alongside Burt at the London County Council, reinforcing and perpetuating the eugenic principles in education settings. In the same period, Burt was consolidating his approach to his own work. He published The Backward Child, which provided the theoretical framework for the tests his colleagues were implementing. In 1924, Burt was appointed as psychology lecturer and head of the Higher Degrees Department at the London Day Training College, now the Institute of Education. A year later, he published The Young Delinquent, which became a core text used in teacher training. In this book, he presented medical conditions such as tuberculosis, syphilis, and general physical weaknesses as hereditary. And he treated behaviors such as wandering and idleness, as well as illiteracy, in the same way. This blurred the distinction between medical conditions and moral or social judgments, even though his own research showed strong correlations with environmental factors, including a correlation of 0.73 with poverty, 0.89 with overcrowding, and 0.93 with infant mortality. Any correlation above 0.7 is generally considered very high, yet Burt chose to overlook these factors. By conflating disability with disease, morality, and social behavior, Burt's work led to many children with health conditions being misdiagnosed and being permanently labeled. The number of categories he used also expanded over time. And this expansion was presented by contemporaries as scientific advance in identifying subnormality. In practice, it simply widened the pool of children who could be classified as dull, backward, maladjusted, or ineducable, even when their difficulties stemmed from illnesses, poverty, or the lack of educational opportunity. These labels did not function as genuine diagnostic categories, but as instruments of social exclusion, significantly limiting many children's life chances. After the Second World War, overt references to racial hygiene and degeneracy declined, but intelligence testing, streaming, and segregation of disabled learners in special schools continued, with deficit thinking intact. The 11+ exam created by the 1944 Education Act reinforced a hierarchical system. Though gradually phased out in state schools during the 1960s and 70s, it still exists in grammar and private schools. Even in the late 60s, Cyril Burt contributed to the Black Papers opposing progressive education and claiming intelligence was innate and unchangeable. Local education authorities, such as the Inner London Education Authority, disproportionately placed Black, Caribbean, and some Asian children into educationally subnormal schools, using culturally biased tests, misinterpreting language and behavior, and acting on racially prejudiced assumptions that limited these children's opportunities. These ideas did not end with Burt or the ILEA. They persist today in what the geographer Danny Dorling calls IQism, the belief that intelligence is inherited, fixed, and measurable, and that resources should favor a gifted elite. A pervasive testing culture, through standardized assessments, entrance examination, and league tables, continues to create immense pressure for both the learner and their families. Disabled learners are disproportionately affected. Those labeled low ability internalize shame and often underachieve, while those deemed gifted face anxiety and the need for perfectionism. For disabled learners from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, intersecting discrimination compounds these effects, particularly as eugenic testing also targeted colonized populations, manipulating results to justify racial hierarchies and imperialism. Understanding this history is crucial because the ways we measure, categorize, and label children continue to shape who succeeds, who struggles, and who is excluded. The key lessons can be summarized in 3 points. Tests are never neutral. Ask what assumptions are built in, who they serve, and who they exclude. Labels limit futures. All children can learn. Create conditions for flourishing, not hierarchies. Inclusion enriches everyone. Segregation harms society and perpetuates prejudice based on deficiency, not diversity. Thank you.